the late 19th and early 20th century. All right, so we shall get started. Most Americans have some knowledge of the first Thanksgiving, how a small band of pilgrims in 1620 braved the perilous North Atlantic crossing in quest of religious freedom, how they landed in November of that year and faced winter with meager supplies of food that dwindled rapidly. Half of that pilgrim band died before spring 1621. When summer weather proved benign and the autumn harvest plentiful, the pilgrims appropriately, gratefully established a day of Thanksgiving and invited the local Wampanoag tribe to share in their bounty, an event that has come to be commemorated every November in this nation. Certainly as it is that the Plymouth colonists held a grateful feast in the fall of 1621, it is unclear that that celebration can truly be labeled a Thanksgiving. And while Thanksgiving is America's oldest and most beloved holiday tradition, it is quite possible that the 1621 Pilgrim Plymouth Thanksgiving, the tale that so many American schoolchildren have been taught, was not the first to be celebrated in the so-called New World of the Americas. And nor was the Pilgrim's Harvest Feast nearly as abundant as legend would have us believe. Our modern American Thanksgiving holiday tradition is one that grew from a regional holiday into a national one, an evolution that was a triumph of Yankee New England salesmanship. Now, if you were to travel around the United States today, you would find at least 5 other locations beyond Plymouth Colony which it is purported that the first Thanksgiving in America was held. Texas claims 2 of these locations. On Highway 217, just outside of Canyon, Texas, is a road marker that dates the feast of the first Thanksgiving as 1541. A year prior, Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, a daring young Spaniard, a conquistador, led a major expedition of some 1,500 men searching for gold, the mythical 7 cities of gold. Although the expedition failed to find gold, he found instead Native Americans, buffalo, the Grand Canyon, and what is now basically the southwestern United States. In May of 1541, Coronado and his men camped for 14 days along Palo Duro Canyon in the Texas Panhandle. On May the 23rd, they held a service led by Padre Fray Juan de Padilla, a Franciscan friar who traveled with Coronado, and celebrated a feast of Thanksgiving to give thanks for the site which offered them abundant food, fresh water, and pasture for their horses. That's the first Thanksgiving tradition that Texans celebrate. There's also a second one. The residents of El Paso, Texas, celebrate their first Thanksgiving as a result of a 1598 declaration by Spanish explorer Don Juan de Onote, who led a band of some 500 men, 7,000 livestock over a 50-day dangerous crossing of the Chihuahua Desert in what is now West Texas, along the border with Mexico. Dry weather had set in, and the expedition ran out of food and water days before finally reaching the Rio Grande River. Following 10 days of recovery, Onote declared April 30th, 1598, to be a day of Thanksgiving and to be celebrated with prayer and a mass. Such spontaneous Thanksgiving services for deliverances from danger were common in that pious age. Florida also claims the first Thanksgiving. Half a century prior to the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth, a small colony of French established a settlement near present-day Jacksonville, Florida. On June 30th, 1564, their leader recorded that they sang a psalm of thanksgiving unto God for rewarding them with his goodness. They held a religious ceremony and shared a feast with the local Timucua tribe. Although the colony was wiped out the next year by a Spanish raiding party moving up the Atlantic coast, Florida proudly proclaims this as their first Thanksgiving, and it is marked by the Fort Caroline Memorial, a replica of the original fort on the St. Johns River. Maine claimed to be the first Thanksgiving as well. Maine's claim to the first Thanksgiving derives from the failed attempt to establish the first permanent English settlement in North America, the so-called Popham Colony. Led by George Popham, the Popham colonists, about 120 in number, arrived at the mouth of the Kennebec River on August the 9th, 1607, and they held a service of Thanksgiving in gratitude for a safe voyage and landing. Unfortunately for the Popham colony, they would be gone in 2 years' time, suffering to adapt to the environment. And that lays claim to the next first Thanksgiving, celebrated by the Virginians, those who would establish the first permanent settlement, English settlement in North America at Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. Now, south of that failed Popham colony is what is now Virginia. And that band of English settlers who settled at Jamestown was at that very moment in struggle against the elements, against disease, against the local Powhatan Confederation of Native Americans, and against hunger as they laid the foundations for Jamestown. In 2 years' time, nearly 500 settlers at Jamestown had been reduced to 60 by the winter of 1609-1610. And always a subject of interest to young kiddos is what happened during the starving time. Not a good, pretty scene, as the residents of Jamestown was left to resort to cannibalism to survive. Now, when Lord Delaware arrived up the James River in the spring of 1610 carrying supplies, the beleaguered settlers at Jamestown greeted him with a service of Thanksgiving. In none of these 6 first Thanksgivings, the 2 in Texas, the 1 in Florida, the 1 in Maine, the 1 in Virginia, and even the 1621 Pilgrim Thanksgiving, did a singular event become a yearly annual celebration. Each was a singular event meant to offer thanks to God for deliverance from danger. Now, our modern Thanksgiving holiday tradition was born as a regional holiday, one that was celebrated by Puritans who settled in the farming villages and towns of New England in the early to mid-17th century. It was shaped by 4 English traditions that their ancestors celebrated in the so-called Old World in Europe. These were the harvest home, Christmas, proclamations of civic thanksgiving, and congregational days of thanksgiving and prayer. The harvest home was a holiday in which villagers joined together to bring the last loads of grain from the fields, in which villagers joined together and shared a merry feast when the work was done. Now, while Christmas, the practice of designating the day of Jesus' birth and of making merry and feasting on that day, was viewed by Puritans as one of the grave errors of the churches of Rome and England, a departure from the purity of the early church. Small pieces of an English Christmas, the gathering of families, and certain Christmas dishes, such as plum pudding and pie, became very much part of this New England Thanksgiving menu. The Puritans were quite familiar with special days of Thanksgiving proclaimed by civil authorities in Europe for any stroke of extraordinary good fortune that might befell a nation. Deliverance from danger, such as the end of an epidemic, rainfall after a drought, and victory in war. These civic declarations of Thanksgiving were common reasons for a feast to celebrate. And finally, Puritan congregational declarations of thanksgiving and prayer, issued by a single individual congregation, were common in the Old World. And they brought that with them to the Americas. Like the civic Thanksgivings, individual New England Puritan congregational Thanksgiving days were declared for special causes, often for the harvest, and were associated with occasion for prayer, of feasting, and of family reunion. These days of Thanksgiving began in the 1630s and 1640s, but these individual congregations initially did not hold them every year. The crucial New England innovation for establishing the tradition of an annual Thanksgiving Day was born in the Connecticut and River Valley towns of Wethersfield, Windsor, and Hartford, when the Puritan civil authorities in these towns began issuing a proclamation of thanksgiving and prayer and celebrating the day as an annual autumn harvest festival in gratitude for the ordinary blessings of the year past and for the fruits of the earth. Beginning with the first such surviving proclamation on September the 18th, 1639, and subsequent proclamations for 1644, and continuing for every year from 1649 onward, a new holiday was born, one that was held whether the harvest was abundant or meager, and regardless of events that had befallen the colony, the town, the village since the previous Thanksgiving Day. Only once, from 1649 to the present, has a disaster overwhelmed the people of Connecticut that they omitted their Thanksgiving annual celebration. And that was the autumn harvest of 1675, when King Philip's War resulted in the end of a long-standing peace with the Wampanoag Indians and the people of New England. Total warfare engulfed New England. Such was the devastation that nearly 20 years passed before most of the devastated towns were resettled. When the tide of the war shifted in 1676, however, in favor of the Puritans, the General Court of Connecticut quickly urged the people of the colony to thank the Lord for, quote, appearing so gloriously for their help in subduing of our enemies, and for the comfortable and plentiful harvest by keeping a day of public thanksgiving, end quote. While the idea of an annual Thanksgiving Day took root in Connecticut, other regions, colonies of New England, rejected an annual celebration in favor of days of thanks set only when there was something special for which to be thankful. In the words of Judge Samuel Sewell, it was, quote, "'twas not fit to command a thanksgiving for general, not specific causes. It would make the people overly confident of the Lord's generosity and insufficiently humble of providential wrath. But as a rich annual tradition of thanksgiving, of giving thanks to God and celebrating a feast among family took root in Connecticut, the people of New England, looking at their neighbors, wanted Thanksgiving too. Beginning in 1668, the people of Plymouth, by a proclamation issued by the General Court, celebrated an annual Thanksgiving holiday in late November. Maine remained a sparsely settled region at this point of Massachusetts, and they followed that colony's laws, and they thus began celebrating an annual Thanksgiving holiday in late November. New Hampshire, later founded by migrants from Connecticut, followed their traditions from Connecticut and began in 1695 with their colony's royal governors issuing annual proclamations of Thanksgiving. Rhode Island, a colony famously settled by men and women too independent-minded and outspoken to get along with their neighboring Puritan colonies, was the last of New Englanders to begin an annual tradition, and that only came during the American Revolutionary War. Now, born of a devout Puritan impulse to thank the Lord for his goodness once each year, the autumn harvest, Thanksgiving Day was already poised to become a holiday beloved by a nation born of independence in the wake of the American Revolutionary War. As the descendants of Puritan New England moved beyond their northeastern borders to settle in the rapidly expanding nation, these children of Puritan New Englanders brought their annual Thanksgiving traditions to their new homes. America's Thanksgiving, at the outset, primarily a day spent in prayer, in church service, thanks to God, became a day in which Thanksgiving dinner, a feast enjoyed by homecoming relatives, became as important as the prayer service. The turkey became synonymous with the Thanksgiving dinner, either before or after attending church services. Men with their musket in hand might take aim at a wild animal or even a paper target in the fields. The prize that the winner would take for his excellent marksmanship was a turkey. The turkey became the focal point of the Thanksgiving dinner alongside a feast of platters of roast meat, winter vegetables, cranberry sauce, and an array of golden, scrumptious pies, often a chicken or pumpkin pie. Soon, new traditions such as sport and recreation enjoyed by homecoming relatives became very much part of the holy day and the Thanksgiving dinner. At first, no particular day of the week was reserved for this annual autumn Thanksgiving tradition. But But some days were thought to be more appropriate than others. Puritans observed the Sabbath as a biblical ordinance and did not intrude their Thanksgiving upon it. Since Saturday was preoccupied with preparations for the Sabbath, and Monday was the day just after, these were not convenient choices. Friday was ruled out because it was the fast day of the Catholic Church, and let's face it, any day of prayer on a Friday would have had popish overtones. But Thursdays, that was lecture day in Boston. Their Puritan ministers offered afternoon sermons, and perhaps for this very reason, Thursday became a favorite day, a choice day for the Puritan annual autumn day of Thanksgiving. By the time of the American Revolution, Puritan New England's Thanksgiving was enlisted for service in the patriot cause by politicians and preachers, endorsing revolutionary ideas in their sermons. Thanksgivings were proclaimed to pray for the repeal of British taxation, to fast and pray for Boston's aid after a series of laws known as the Intolerable Acts were levied against the citizens of that city for their actions taken by the Sons of Liberty at the Boston Tea Party. And proclamations of Thanksgiving were declared by the Continental Congress after driving the British from Boston in 1776 and defeating British armies at Saratoga in 1777 and Yorktown in 1781. As new states were admitted to the new United States of America, the governors of each of these states soon began the practice of issuing an annual day of Thanksgiving, thus firmly establishing Thanksgiving each autumn as an official holiday at the state level. At the national level, however, Thanksgiving very much had the potential to become an annual national holiday from the very beginning. However, the very few early American presidents who did issue proclamations of Thanksgiving did so only as marking single days of Thanksgiving, and though religion was still very much an underlying theme in each of these proclamations, each presidential proclamation acquired a political aura about them that hindered efforts to make Thanksgiving a national holiday tradition. On September the 25th, 1789, just after the members of the First United States Congress had completed the work of drafting a Bill of Rights to be sent out to the states for ratification, a New Jersey congressman rose to propose that the House and Senate jointly request of President George Washington that he issue a proclamation day of Thanksgiving for, quote, the many signal favors of Almighty God, especially by affording them an opportunity peacefully to establish a constitutional government for their safety and happiness, end quote. Some congressmen immediately dissented. After all, the newly enacted Constitution was still very much controversial by those who believed the states to be sovereign and objected to the efforts of the founding fathers at the Philadelphia Convention, who had scrapped the Articles of Confederation for a much more powerful central government. A member from South Carolina stood and proclaimed that the people, quote, may not be inclined to return thanks for a constitution until they have experienced that it promotes their safety and happiness. If a day of Thanksgiving must take place, let it be done by the authority of the several states, end quotes. It was the Federalists who were in charge of the federal government, George Washington's party, and they will carry the day. And on October 3rd, 1789, the first Thanksgiving proclamation by an American president was issued by Washington in gratitude for the enactment of the Constitution. The date of the first National Day of Thanks was set for Thursday, November the 26th, 1789. Last Thursday in November, and that was in keeping with the New England tradition. Washington would also issue a second Thanksgiving proclamation for February 19th, 1795, which would anger his Federalist political opponents, the Jeffersonians, because it was issued to give thanks for Washington's success in dissolving a rebellion against a federal tax on distilled spirits, the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. And so with this, you start getting the politics getting involved in these Thanksgiving proclamations. Other American presidents who would issue Thanksgiving proclamations. Washington's successor, John Adams, issued 2 Thanksgiving proclamations, National Days of Fasting and Prayer for May the 9th, 1798, and April 25th, 1799, as he sought divine assistance for the United States in avoiding war that looked like it was impending from France. Efforts were made to get President Thomas Jefferson to follow Washington and Adams' example and issue a Thanksgiving proclamation, but Jefferson refused, considering himself barred from proclaiming days of Thanksgiving because, quote, civil powers alone have been given to the President of the United States and no authority to direct the religious exercise of his constituents, end quote. Jefferson was standing fast on his position that there must be a wall of separation between church and state. However, Jefferson's successor, President James Madison, also would set aside 2 national days of Thanksgiving like Washington and Adams. But these were for the War of 1812, for delivering the United States from deliverance of danger of the British at a second occasion in the War of 1812. Following Madison, and he issued those dates for September 9th, 1813, and April the 12th, 1815. Following Madison, no other American president would issue a national day of Thanksgiving until the American Civil War. But even as Thanksgiving began to be celebrated on an annual basis in each new state admitted to the Union by proclamation issued by their governors, and even as it was being celebrated in Western territories prior to them becoming states, there was still no consensus among Americans for an annual day of Thanksgiving. It was the work of transplanted New England Yankees that sowed the seeds of Thanksgiving as they moved west and carried their annual autumn Thanksgiving traditions with them. By 1860, officially speaking, Thanksgiving was very much a holiday celebrated from the Atlantic to the Pacific, but one sanctioned by state action rather than by the federal government. Enter Sarah Hale, a woman born in New Hampshire in 1788 to a Revolutionary War veteran and his wife. As Sarah matured into a young woman, she married and became a mother, but she was suddenly tragically left a poor widow with 5 children to support in an era where there were few professions open to women to earn an adequate living. Sarah determined to support her family with her pen. She wrote a successful novel, which led her to a job as an editor of the Ladies' Magazine in Boston, one of the earliest women's magazines, and the first to be edited by a woman, Sarah Hale. In 1837, the Ladies' Magazine merged with another magazine to become Godey's Ladies' Book. Sarah was appointed its editor, and she moved her family to its office in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Godey's Ladies' Book was one of the most widely read and distributed magazines in the antebellum United States. It was read in New York City. It was read on southern slave plantations and in cabins along the western frontier. When Godey's Ladies' Book printed a new bonnet style, it was sold coast to coast. And when they published architectural plans for a model cottage, carpenters built houses like the ones they saw pictured in Godey's Ladies' Book. Such was the platform that Sarah commanded, and knowing this, she began a campaign to make the last Thursday in November a national Thanksgiving holiday, much like, again, the annual autumn Thanksgivings that she and her family had celebrated in New England. As summer waned each year, Sarah wrote editorials on the desirability of a national Thanksgiving Day. November issues of Godey's Ladies' Book featured Thanksgiving poetry and stories of families reunited on Thanksgiving Day. She included household advice columns with directions on how to stuff a turkey and bake a pie. Sarah Hale intended to tell her readers about Thanksgiving and teach them how to celebrate it until Thanksgiving was as familiar as a household custom in Alabama and the Kansas Territory as it was in New Hampshire and Connecticut. Moreover, each summer she wrote the governor of each state, each territory, urging them to proclaim the last Thursday in November as Thanksgiving, to build the foundation for a national holiday. Her request fell on fertile soil. Not only had the seeds of Thanksgiving been sowed by transplanted New England Yankees like Sarah, but also at the mid-19th century, America was very much a God-fearing nation. the fruits of the Second Great Awakening having produced a groundswell of religious fervor that continued to reverberate as Protestant churches across the nation favored officially proclaimed days of Thanksgiving. As the nation careened towards disunion over the cancerous issue of slavery in the 1850s, Sarah Hale expanded her argument for a national holiday, as she argued that a national Thanksgiving holiday could be used as a useful tool to preserve the Union in harmony and compromise. On the eve of the election of 1860, as Southern fire eaters, pro-slavery politicians, openly discussed separation from the Union if the Republicans seized the presidency and Congress, Sarah appealed for a national day of Thanksgiving to hold the Union together, invoking the Constitution, George Washington, and God's mercy to save the American Republic. However, no compromise, and certainly no national holiday, could accommodate Southern convictions that slavery was an institution that the South was entitled to maintain, and nor could it satisfy Northern demands that this evil cancer be abolished. It was too late, and the war came. During the American Civil War, both the Union and Confederates acted in accord with the traditions that had been established celebrating days of Thanksgiving for battlefield victories. The Confederates celebrated 2 Thanksgivings after the battles of First and Second Bull Run, whereas President Lincoln issued proclamations of Thanksgiving for victories in Tennessee in 1862, Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, and Shiloh. And in the summer of 1863, he did so again after the twin Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. On September 28, 1863, the now relentless 74-year-old Sarah Hale sat in her Philadelphia office as she penned yet another letter to a president of the United States, this time urging Abraham Lincoln to, quote, have the day of our annual Thanksgiving made a national and fixed Union festival, end quote. She went on, quote, you may have observed that for some years past that there has been an increasing interest felt in our land to have the Thanksgiving held on the same day in all the states. It now needs national recognition and authoritative fixation only to become permanently as American custom and institution, end quote. After 17 long years, letters addressed to 5 American presidents, Sarah Hale finally found in Lincoln a president willing to cooperate. On October the 3rd, 1863, by presidential proclamation, Lincoln proclaimed a nationwide Thanksgiving Day for the last Thursday of November 1863. A Thanksgiving proclaimed not in celebration of a military victory, but in gratitude for a, quote, year filled with the blessings of fruitful fields and healthful skies, end quote. It was a Thanksgiving very much in the New England tradition of setting aside a Thursday in autumn to give thanks for general cause. And it was one that invoked the blessings of the ever-watchful providence of Almighty God. Lincoln saw in a nationwide Thanksgiving holiday an opportunity for national reconciliation after the American Civil War, for Americans to come together as a nation and to show their thanks for national progress. And as such, Lincoln, with yet another letter from Hale in 1864, as a friendly reminder, issued a second National Day of Thanksgiving for the last Thursday of November in 1864, as he had done in 1863, with the intention, though he can't see the future, of making Thanksgiving an annual American tradition. When Americans observed the Thanksgiving holiday on the last Thursday in November 1864, for the second time in consecutive years, the modern American Thanksgiving holiday was established, just so long as future presidents would follow Lincoln's lead. And his successor, when Lincoln is rapidly exit the stage in April 1865 at Ford's Theater, Andrew Johnson of Greenville, Tennessee, when he becomes president, he is preoccupied with the reconciliation, bringing the country back together, and he almost forgot to issue a Thanksgiving proclamation. He had to be reminded by Sarah Hale again to issue a proclamation, and it came so late It's the only presidential proclamation of Thanksgiving that was not held in November. It was held on the first Thursday in December, 1865. Few Americans were able to celebrate that Thanksgiving because of the wrath, the destruction of the American Civil War. Beginning in 1866, Andrew Johnson, with his second Thanksgiving proclamation, set the stage of the last Thursday in November. Now, in 1941, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt has the honor of establishing a proclamation that states it will be the fourth Thursday in November. And the reason for that was because of businessmen who argued that when that last Thursday in November came so late, it took away very vitally important days for Christmas shopping. Now, in the time that I have before I hold you all here till midnight, I do want to say a little bit of word about Thanksgiving in November to bring it to our city here. Thanksgiving, that first Thanksgiving that Lincoln issued was November 26, 1863. And for the people of Knoxville, it was not an occasion to celebrate. The Union Army had now been in control of Knoxville for a couple months after driving the Confederates out in September of 1863. The image on the left is of Fort Sanders, and you can see a very desolate, now you can't see downtown area, that is developed downtown, but it was war-torn already with bullet holes in many buildings. But the Union Army was very much looking out west towards West Knoxville and approaching General James Longstreet and the Confederate Army for the Battle of Fort Sanders. And when that Thanksgiving came, the Union Army was in dire straits. They were really hungry, on half rations. And on that day, Ellen Renshaw House, a teenage Confederate rebel through and through, wrote in her diary that it was, quote, Yankee Thanksgiving Day. Kingdom only knows what they have to give thanks for in this part of the world, end quotes. She further noted that Union soldiers, quote, are begging all around town, say they don't get quarter rations, end quote. The general in charge was one Ambrose Burnside. Now, this is not an image. I don't want you to leave an impression that this is Knoxville, Tennessee. But this is General Ambrose Burnside and his staff. And they celebrated Thanksgiving Day, November 26, 1863, in the home of the Temples. Now, Judge Oliver Temple, seen there on the right next to his wife, was not in town. He had fled with Parson Brownlow, Horace Maynard, prominent Knoxvillians, because if Longstreet took the city, they'd probably be strung up. They had fled through the Cumberland Mountains on their way to Cincinnati, Ohio for protection. But Miss Temple and her 7-year-old daughter, pictured with her grandmother, that is Mary Boyce Temple there on the left, were home at the Temple house when Ambrose Burnside and his men had Thanksgiving dinner in her house. And it was a feast that Oliver Temple writes about in his book on East Tennesseans in the Civil War. And it appears on a footnote somewhere near the very end of that book. And he documents what happened that day because of a Union soldier who appeared in Knoxville in the 1890s. He had been on the staff of Ambrose Burnside. And this young man had been Colonel William Hamilton Harris, a New Yorker. And he knocked on the door. He had known that Miss Temple, Judge Temple's wife, had passed away, sadly, years before. But he wanted Judge Temple, and he wanted to see especially his daughter, Mary Boyce Temple. Because he had seen Mary Boyce Temple in 1863, the 7-year-old, and he told Judge Temple that your wife was so gracious in opening her home to my men, General Ambrose Burnside and our staff, and gave us a scrumptious dinner. The only point that things got a little nervous at that event was when coffee was served. And General Ambrose Burnside said, I cannot partake in the coffee, Miss Temple. It's no disrespect, but my men are basically starving. It's not to say that they had enjoyed the dinner and everything, but he cut it short at coffee. Colonel William Hamilton Harris of New York is actually an interesting figure. He comes back here in the 1890s when Knoxville is celebrating Civil War reunions, blue and gray reunions of both sides coming together. And Colonel William Hamilton Harris, he had been the brother of Miss Clara Harris, who, in the company of a young Major W.R. Rathbone, had been in the president's box at Ford's Theater on April the 14th, 1865. So a little connection there with Lincoln, and the connection with Miss Temple here in that first Thanksgiving. Knoxville, to bring it to a close, a subject of passion of mine, and to bring up sports and Thanksgiving, Knoxville didn't really have celebrations in 1865, at least the newspapers don't report it. And in 1866, the only mentions of Thanksgiving are preachers who are going to hold church services in honor of Thanksgiving Mass. But Knoxville turned out in 1867 for Thanksgiving. The pastor of several churches had arranged for their congregations to meet at Second Presbyterian Church at 10 a.m. on Thanksgiving Day for appropriate services. The afternoon was for sport. Downtown Gay Street, where today you have Mass General Store in the 400 and what was the 300 block of Gay Street, a major baseball game was being played. As Knoxville had started playing baseball, this new national sport also imported into the South by Yankees. A huge game, a traveling club out of Atlanta, the Gate City Club of Atlanta, had come in. They were undefeated. They'd beaten everybody. They were the precursors of the Cincinnati Red Stockings, traveling, barnstorming, playing teams all across the country. And they played the Knoxville Holston Club. And it was a game that went down into the ninth, and then the Holstons had the lead until the bottom of the ninth, and the Gate City Club turned out went on a hitting spell and won the game by 3 runs. But afterwards, a major feast was held. Judge Baxter's wife held a huge Thanksgiving Day dinner for both clubs. And it is sort of that link how sport gradually becomes, because as someone who hails from the bluegrass myself, when I came here, I knew we were nuts about basketball. I had no idea how nuts you guys were about football. And obviously football, baseball sort of being played here in Knoxville shortly after, and those games would always take place on Thanksgiving as part of the celebration. And then with that, I'll stop here, or we will be here till midnight. I'll be happy to take any questions you have.
I think you mentioned it, but when was it officially a national holiday? Was it 41?
Well, that's the thing.
We don't know.
If we want to go with the date of the fourth Thursday, that is by proclamation of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1941, which really establishes the day now that we celebrate. But becoming a national history, national holiday tradition, that begins with Lincoln, because no president after Lincoln failed, except for Andrew Johnson, came close. And it was held in December. But every president after that kept the tradition of Lincoln, his 1863 proclamation, of doing it on the last Thursday. And it was only in that period of the Great Depression, when businesses were eager to get as much days in for shopping, that they urged President Roosevelt, please, let's move it up to the fourth Thursday, so when we have 5 Thursdays, we can at least get 6 or 7 more days of shopping. Yes.
I believe that Lincoln, was he the first to pardon a turkey?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, but obviously throughout the 20th century, you can find photos of every single president pardoning a turkey. As far as I know, Lincoln didn't do that, but I'm not going to say with 100% certainty. The answer to my students is I will get back to you. That's the appropriate answer.
So the turkey is strictly a American input. That didn't come from England, right?
Yeah, that's more about the...
Because there's so many of them here. Almost the national bird and all.
That's more about the sort of, you get the families in and the men going out doing some recreational fun while their wives are preparing the dinner.
Turkey to be the national bird.
I don't know about that.
Yeah.
But obviously, by the time Mr. Franklin's around, the turkey is already part and parcel of at least the New England tradition. And he's in Pennsylvania, so the New Englanders are his next door neighbor. That turkey tradition is already baked into the annual holiday by, I'm sorry, puns, yes. My college students are always like, they know it's coming by this point in the semester. By the 18th century, before we get to 1700s,
Right.
turkeys are already synonymous as the focal point of the dinner.
Man.
Yes. As the men would bring in, obviously the expert marksman has the prize-winning turkey, but every other gentleman, so I've got a turkey, so maybe they claim that they were the winner of the shootout to their wives or family.
Right.
Very good.
Did you say what day every year the president makes the proclamation? Is it a certain?
Oh, that changes. It used to be this is a good point. I didn't fit it into the speech. George Washington, doing the first Thanksgiving proclamation, issued it on October the 3rd, 1789, for the last Thursday in November. So when Sarah Held writes Lincoln on September 28th, he gets that letter. You can't just click and send the email. She didn't FaceTime with Abraham Lincoln. It probably took several days to get from Philadelphia to D.C. But he responds on October 3rd, knowing that George Washington had issued his proclamation on October 3rd. So there is a tradition early on of American presidents kind of doing it on October 3rd to follow Washington's lead. But if you look at more recent presidents, from Donald Trump back to Joe Biden, and go back, now they issue it like days before Thanksgiving. All the proclamations are coming like on November 20th. It's usually about a week before. I guess we can expedite things. Back in those days, it was important for the president to issue the proclamation and newspapers to print it so word would get out.
Yeah, how did they distribute the word?
That's how they would distribute the word through print.
Newspaper.
Yes.
But does there need to be a proclamation?
To keep that tradition, no president is. Right now, I would think Americans know because of that act of President Franklin Roosevelt in November of '41, because that act is there. It is a national tradition, but the president's still going to do it. It's great PR to bring the media in as they pardon and save that turkey. And they get another turkey for their dinner. Yeah. Well, thank you. This is fun. This was a lot of fun, and I am, as an employee of Lincoln Memorial and as a Lincoln Scholar of the university, I'm contractually obligated wherever I go to wear Lincoln ties and mention Lincoln. So, well, indeed, I got to tell you, I hadn't got to Springfield till about 6 or 7 years ago. My mom and dad, they raised a son who loves history, and they're retired, and they said, William, would you like to go to Springfield? I'm like, yes. I spent 3 days there, but one thing I took away. The people of Springfield must get sick of Abraham Lincoln because it's everywhere. But this historian, this nerd was just in heaven. I've been back to Springfield at least several times since. Yeah.
That museum is something, isn't it?
Oh, it's indeed that library. Now we're very proud of our library. Our library was first, and a lot of Lincoln stuff collectors, because Lincoln, by the late 19th century, as the country really reconciles around the Spanish-American War into the early 20th century, when Lincoln Memorial was established in 1897, very quick, it's an idea. Lincoln collectors out there say, well, when I die, I want to leave it with this university has this name. What's a university doing in East Tennessee, in the Cumberland Gap, where Lincoln never stepped foot in Tennessee? What's it there? And that's a story for another day. But Lincoln collectors, when they died, they willed it to the university. And thanks to Colonel Sanders of KFC fame, helped write the check that built the museum in the 1970s, an actual museum to house the artifacts there. But since the Lincoln Library in Springfield, all Lincoln collectors today will send their stuff, when they pass away or they acquire for preservation. It all goes to Springfield today. It's a treasure. We have some great treasures. The only photograph of Lincoln's father is at LMU. A lot of great treasures there. Well, I thank you all for coming out on this Thursday.